You may have watched us construct these compost heaps end of last season. We're starting to fill these up now with some fresh garden waste and clearings. I need to move those daffodils out of the base because they're going to go to waste if we don't over the next few years. But a great tip to try and get decent compost, and you can see this is one of the mature heaps. Good sign that compost is ready to be used on a garden is when you've got plants growing out the top of it. We're starting to break that up, but a good tip is to start turning these heaps one into the other and combining some of these longer established heaps. By turning the material, you're going to increase the speed of the breakdown and you're going to get compost that much quicker. If you're happy to have plenty of space, you can do a slow composting technique and just leave them be, cover them over on the top. It takes about 3 to 4 years to get really fine compost. By turning them, you'll accelerate that down to around 6 to 12 months. If you grow crown fritillarias or Fritillaria imperialis, they'll be looking a little like this now. Flowering season's very short, colours fading out of the flowers, but now's the time to get some feed onto these plants to really invigorate the bulbs for next season. Don't try moving them at this time of year, just give them a really good feed. These are very deep bulbs and you need to wait until they're completely dormant if you want to propagate these by dividing the clumps. So get some feed on them now, get the bulbs in peak condition, and then in early autumn that's the time to get a real good spade under these and move them to the positions you want them to flower in the following season. If you've got tulips and other bulbs growing in pots, they're probably very concentrated to give you a good display like these. But now's the time to get some liquid feed into these pots, again to reinvigorate the bulbs and give them the best chance of growing on and forming good sized bulbs that will flower the following season. It's not a good idea to leave them in the same pot year after year. Here's an example of what happens if you try that. They lose their vigour, the compost is spent. Even with the best feed in the world, after a few seasons they just don't get the nutrients they want. Better to plant these out into rows in your vegetable garden or into your borders. Either use them as a cutting garden plant and grow them on that way, or plant them out into a flowering border. But again, this time of year, while the bulb's active, you need to get the feed in and around the roots and on the foliage to really invigorate and firm up those bulbs to form good sized flowering bulbs for the following year. Honesty, one of my favourite cottage garden plants, and really coming into its own now in the late part of April, beginning of May here in the UK. It's a biannual plant that seeds regularly and reliably. The seed pods are beautiful as well. They're almost translucent, large round things that float around in the wind and blow all around the garden. And if you want to grow Honesty, then you have to be prepared to let it seed and grow the plants during this year to get this size plant, which will flower the subsequent year. And these are the seedlings as they're starting to emerge at this time of year. That's the first petal or leaf that comes up from the seed, and then you get this typical serrated triangular-like leaf, and these little plants, you can see there's here, loads of them all around this plant. This is the stage that if you do want to transplant the Honesty to various locations within your garden, this is the time to do it. Get them while they're this size, just in the 1 or 2 leaf stage, get a trowel under them, dig them up, and you should have a good root formation that you don't disturb too much and will transplant nicely to a new location. Here's a nice little example plant that I've managed just to loosen, and you'll see lovely actively growing root coming away from that. Small plant, will transplant that either directly into the position that you want it to flower the following season, or you can grow those on as pots, give them to friends, transplant them later in the season when you decide where you want to have them. But it really is worth growing because this spectacular mauve flower that's so profuse in the garden at this time. And if you manage to grow it in clumps like this, you can see we've got Aquilegia and hollyhocks coming in later to fill this flowering area. But at this time of year it's one of the first things to burst into colour like this, and it's absolutely charming. Would recommend you give Honesty a go. It's available from most seed suppliers, and if you don't have friends that grow it and can get seedlings from, That's probably the best way of introducing it into your garden for the first year. After that, you should have a ready supply of them going on. If you've planted out rows of tulips that you've had in pots over the previous few years, you'll probably end up with a little area in your vegetable garden that we call a cutting garden here in the UK. And from here we can cut regular flowers to take into the house. But make sure you do cut them regularly. If you leave it too long, these tulips will go over very quickly. So if you've got a cutting garden, make sure you're cutting regularly and bringing this crop into the garden, kitchen and house as you would any other vegetable crop. And you're effectively deadheading them at the same time. So the bulbs will be strong. Feed them at this time of year as you would potted bulbs or anywhere else where you're growing bulbs while they're in the green, to firm those bulbs up and get everything that they need to flower reliably the following season. And it's well worth putting any potted bulbs that you can't think of an area to put in the borders into your vegetable plot to have as a cutting crop. Start cutting chives and other herbs at this time of year while they're still growing strongly and in the green. These little clumps of chives were transplanted from self-seeded areas in another part of the garden last year, and they're growing away beautifully. We've got a few little flower heads coming on them. As you can see, those little purpley green tips are going to flower later in the season, but these whole clumps can be cut down perfectly well at this time. Just get a handful, pair of scissors, cut right through them. They'll reshoot and give you fresh green growth that doesn't get woody and doesn't have any thick stalks in it, can be chopped up directly and eaten. Absolutely wonderful. And the same with the marjoram in the distance. The golden marjoram is now really growing away well. Start harvesting these herbs regularly at this time of year as soon as they start into growth. They're at their best this time of year before they start getting woody, and they're really, really tasty. Have a job for this weekend. Regularly check and harvest your forced rhubarb. We've still got loads of crowns covered here. We've harvested one, but just look, we've got more ready. Just look at that. Absolutely fantastic crop of forced pink champagne first rhubarb, which will be tender and need a lot less sugar than rhubarb grown in full light. So keep picking this regularly. You don't want to leave it too long. If you do, they'll overheat and just rot. So pick, pick, pick.